Canada has just done something that no allied nation has ever dared to do to the United States of America. Not Russia, not China, not Iran. Canada, our neighbor, our largest trading partner, the country that shares the longest undefended border in human history. This morning, Thursday, March 6th, 2026, at precisely 8:47 a.m. Eastern Time, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked into the National Press Theatre in Ottawa and uttered 11 words that have sent shockwaves through every financial capital on Earth. He said, "Canada is formally withdrawing from the 2025 bilateral debt arrangement with the United States." That sentence, those 11 words, they just detonated a financial bomb inside the United States Treasury. We are talking about a $1.2 trillion debt agreement, gone, torn up, announced in front of cameras with the Canadian flag standing at attention right behind him. This is the image they said we would never see. An ally, a partner, a country that depends on American security guarantees and military umbrella, standing at a podium and pulling the financial pin. For decades, Canada has been the quiet, polite neighbor who absorbed whatever Washington demanded. Trade disputes, softwood lumber tariffs, dairy quotas. Canada grumbled, Canada negotiated, and Canada ultimately complied. That was the old Canada. But at 8:47 this morning, that Canada died. What you are witnessing right now is the financial equivalent of Canada detonating a neutron bomb aimed directly at the US Treasury, and the blast radius is enormous. Here is what the mainstream media is not going to tell you in the next hour. This is not just a trade dispute. This is not just diplomatic posturing. This $1.2 trillion debt arrangement is the structural backbone of North American financial architecture. When Canada tears it up, it does not just hurt feelings in Washington. It triggers automatic covenant clauses in 17 separate multilateral lending agreements. It forces the Federal Reserve into an emergency review of its foreign reserve calculations. And it sends a message to every sovereign debt holder on the planet, from Tokyo to Riyadh to Beijing, that American financial partnerships are no longer sacred, that American agreements can be countered, that the empire has cracks in its foundation. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly what this $1.2 trillion agreement actually was. We are going to explain why Canada chose this specific weapon on this specific morning and why the timing is not accidental. We are going to walk you through the chain reaction that is already beginning inside the U.S. financial system. And we are going to answer the one question that every economist and every senator in Washington is terrified to answer right now. Can the United States survive a hostile financial decoupling by its most integrated economic partner? Buckle up, because what comes next will redefine the relationship between these two countries for the next 50 years. To understand why Ottawa chose this morning to pull this trigger, we need to go back 18 months. We need to go back to the summer of 2024, when the Trump administration, flush from its electoral victory, began quietly negotiating what insiders were calling the North American Financial Stabilization Compact. The public never heard much about it. The press conferences were brief. The details were deliberately buried in Treasury Department appendices that nobody reads. But here is what that agreement actually was. Canada agreed to maintain a minimum holding of $1.2 trillion in U.S. Treasury instruments, bonds, notes, and bills, as part of a bilateral arrangement that gave Washington predictable demand for its debt at a time when global appetite for American treasuries was beginning to soften. In exchange, Canada received preferential tariff treatment on 62 categories of goods, guaranteed U.S. military logistics support for Arctic sovereignty operations, and a series of side agreements on cross-border energy infrastructure that were worth, conservatively, $340 billion to the Canadian economy over a decade. It was, at its core, a protection arrangement. Canada buys your debt, you protect our interests. Simple, ancient, the kind of deal empires have been making since Rome. But here is what changed. Over the past 11 weeks, according to sources with direct knowledge of the Canadian Finance Ministry's internal deliberations, sources whose information was confirmed by two separate Reuters correspondents in Ottawa, the Trump administration quietly began unraveling its side of the bargain. The preferential tariff treatment, canceled in February, replaced with a blanket 27% tariff on Canadian manufactured goods as part of the administration's broader industrial protection agenda. The Arctic military logistics support, reduced by 40% after the Pentagon reallocation of assets to the Pacific Theater. The energy infrastructure agreements stalled in the Office of Management and Budget since January 15th, with no projected movement date. Canada held up its end. America did not. And at 8:47 this morning, Canada sent Washington the bill. And here's where it really gets serious, because withdrawing from a $1.2 trillion Treasury holding arrangement is not as simple as selling bonds. You cannot liquidate $1.2 trillion in U.S. debt overnight. The market cannot absorb that. If Canada dumps its holdings too fast, it crashes the very instruments it is trying to exit. What the Carney announcement actually means, and this is the part that is making Treasury officials physically sick right now, is that Canada is signaling it will not roll over its existing holdings when they mature. It will not buy new issuances. It is going on a buyer's strike. Over the next 36 months, as those instruments mature at roughly $33 billion per quarter, Canada simply stops reinvesting. The demand disappears. And in a Treasury market already struggling with $36.2 trillion in total national debt and a federal deficit running at $2.1 trillion annually, losing a reliable $1.2 trillion anchor buyer is not an inconvenience. It is a catastrophe. Target one in the blast zone is the 30-year Treasury bond. The 30-year is the canary in the coal mine for long-term U.S. fiscal credibility. It already spiked 14 basis points in the first 47 minutes after Carney's press conference. If you don't know what basis points mean, here is what matters. Mortgage rates in the United States are directly correlated to the 30-year Treasury yield. Every 10 basis points the yield rises. Roughly 30 million American homeowners see their refinancing costs go up. 14 basis points in 47 minutes. Do the math. Target 2 is the Canadian dollar carry trade. Right now, as we speak, currency traders around the world are repricing every position that assumes continued Canada-US financial integration. The CAD-USD pair moved 1.8% in the first hour of trading after the announcement. That sounds small. It is not small. A 1.8% move in a major currency pair in 60 minutes is the equivalent of a financial earthquake. Pension funds in 31 U.S. states have direct exposure to cross-border CAD positions. Those pension funds hold the retirement savings of school teachers in Ohio, firefighters in Georgia, and retired postal workers in Arizona. Every one of them just got poorer this morning, and most of them don't know it yet. Target 3 is the aluminum and steel supply chain. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next, because what most analysts are focusing on, the bond market, the currency move, is actually not the most dangerous consequence of what Canada just did. The most dangerous consequence is buried in subsection 7 of the withdrawal notice that Canadian Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland filed simultaneously with Carney's press conference. Subsection 7 invokes what is called a reciprocal industrial preference clause. In plain English, Canada is suspending the automatic export priority status that guarantees American manufacturers first access to Canadian aluminum, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth materials. We are talking about 34% of American aluminum supply. We are talking about 61% of American nickel supply. We are talking about materials that go into F-35 fighter jets, into electric vehicle batteries, into semiconductor manufacturing equipment. This is not a tariff dispute. This is Canada holding the keys to American industrial supply chains and asking very politely what Washington would like to do next. Let's talk about what is happening inside the White House right now, because sources with knowledge of the National Security Council's emergency session, a session that was convened within 19 minutes of the Carney announcement, describe the atmosphere as nothing short of controlled pandemonium. The president was reportedly in the middle of a previously scheduled call with the European Commission when aides interrupted with the Ottawa news. The call was immediately terminated. 3 cabinet secretaries, Treasury, Commerce, and State, are reportedly in the Situation Room as of this broadcast. The National Economic Council director has been on the phone with the heads of J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup simultaneously. And here is the detail that tells you everything about how serious this is. The Federal Reserve Board of Governors, which almost never convenes on anything shorter than 72 hours notice for non-emergency matters, has called an unscheduled board meeting for 2 p.m. Eastern this afternoon. The Fed does not call emergency meetings for minor inconveniences. The last time the Federal Reserve convened an unscheduled board session mid-morning was March 15th, 2020. You remember what happened next. And here is what nobody on television is talking about right now. The $1.2 trillion that Canada is withdrawing does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a web of what are called cross-collateralization agreements, arrangements between sovereign debt holders that link their positions together for stability purposes. Canada's withdrawal triggers a review clause in agreements held by South Korea, Japan, Australia, and the United Kingdom. None of those countries are required to follow Canada. But here is the brutal diplomatic mathematics. If South Korea decides that if Canada can cancel and survive, perhaps South Korea can renegotiate its own terms. If Japan, which holds $1.1 trillion in treasuries, decides the Canada precedent gives it new leverage, the arithmetic becomes existential for the U.S. debt market. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is looking at a potential cascade scenario that none of the models built in 2020 or 2022 were designed to handle. According to a former senior Treasury official who spoke to the Financial Times this morning on condition of anonymity, and I am quoting from the published report here, the official described the situation as a stress test that was never supposed to be activated. Now, here is what the Trump administration is going to do, and why every option available to Washington is worse than the last. Option 1, retaliation tariffs. This is the instinctive move. Hit Canada with 50%, 75%, 100% tariffs on everything crossing the border. The problem is that the United States imports $428 billion worth of Canadian goods annually. Energy, food, lumber, materials. Tariffing those imports at punitive rates does not hurt Canada more than America. It raises prices for American consumers who are already seeing a consumer price index running at 4.1% annually. You cannot fight a supply chain war without shooting your own supply chain. Option 2, invoking the USMCA dispute mechanism. This is the legal route. File formal complaints under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, argue that the debt withdrawal violates the spirit of the Trade Compact's financial cooperation provisions, and let the arbitration panels sort it out. The problem with option 2 is time. USMCA arbitration panels take 14 to 22 months to convene and issue rulings. The bond market will not wait 22 months. The aluminum supply chain will not wait 22 months. By the time the lawyers finish arguing, the damage is done. Option 3, and this is the one that has constitutional scholars genuinely alarmed this morning, is what administration hardliners are reportedly advocating inside the Situation Room right now. And here is where it really gets serious. Sources close to the National Security Council tell us that at least 2 senior advisors have raised the possibility of invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, EPI, to freeze Canadian assets held in U.S. financial institutions as retaliatory leverage. EPA has been invoked 47 times in American history, most recently against Iran, Russia, and Venezuela. It has never been invoked against Canada. It has never been invoked against a NATO ally. It has never been invoked against a country with whom the United States shares 5,525 miles of open border. If Washington pulls that trigger, it does not just damage the Canada relationship. It tells every allied nation on earth that their assets inside U.S. institutions are hostage to Washington's political mood. The foreign direct investment that American financial institutions depend on, $7.3 trillion of it from allied democracies, becomes a different calculation overnight. Usually, when a bilateral economic dispute reaches this level of severity, the pressure release valve is a G7 phone call, a quiet conversation between finance ministers, a communique about shared values and the importance of the transatlantic relationship. Not today, because Canada did not just tear up this agreement. Canada timed its announcement for 8:47 a.m. Eastern, which is 2:47 p.m. in Brussels, specifically, according to Canadian diplomatic sources cited by Le Monde, to coordinate with a European Union trade policy meeting already underway. Brussels was not surprised by Carney's announcement. Brussels was briefed. The European Union, which has been quietly watching the tariff escalations of the past 60 days with growing alarm, reportedly signaled to Ottawa last week that it would not condemn Canada's action in the immediate 72-hour period following the announcement. That silence, that deliberate non-condemnation, is the geopolitical equivalent of a green light. Washington has spent the last 14 months burning bridges with European partners over tariff disputes, NATO funding arguments, and Ukraine policy divergences. Today, those burned bridges are now a strategic liability. And here's where the psychology of this moment becomes important for you to understand. Mark Carney is not a hothead. He is not a nationalist firebrand. He is a former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He understands bond markets the way a surgeon understands anatomy. When Mark Carney tears up a $1.2 trillion agreement, he has done the math. He knows exactly what the blast radius looks like. He knows exactly which American pressure points this action strikes. He knows the cross-collateralization cascade risk better than anyone in Washington does because he helped design the post-2008 sovereign debt stability architecture. This is not impulsive. This is surgical. And the precision of it, the subsection 7 industrial preference clause, the coordinated Brussels timing, the simultaneous finance ministry filing, tells you that Canada has been preparing this move for weeks, maybe longer. The question you should be asking is not why Canada did this. The question is what else they have prepared that we have not seen yet. Let me explain what happens in the next 14 days, because this is the timeline that determines whether this becomes a manageable diplomatic crisis or a structural rupture in the North American economic order. In the next 48 hours, the Federal Reserve's 2 p.m. meeting either issues a calming statement that temporarily stabilizes bond yields or it does not. If it does not, the 30-year Treasury yield breaks through the 5.4% threshold that multiple quantitative models identify as the level at which the debt servicing cost of the national debt begins crowding out discretionary federal spending in ways that trigger automatic budget sequestration mechanisms. In the next 72 hours, two things happen simultaneously. The first, USMCA diplomatic contact either produces a back-channel negotiation, a signal that both sides want an off-ramp, or it does not. And the aluminum futures market either stabilizes on the assumption of a near-term resolution or it begins pricing in a sustained supply disruption. Alcoa, Century Aluminum, and Kaiser Aluminum will all face analyst calls in the next 72 hours. What their executives say about their Canadian supply access will move markets. In the next 7 days, the real test arrives: congressional reaction. Right now, 6 Republican senators from industrial states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, represent constituencies with direct and measurable economic exposure to Canadian raw material supply chains. Those senators are already receiving briefings from Chamber of Commerce presidents, union leadership, and manufacturing executives in their home states. The political mathematics for those 6 senators is increasingly uncomfortable. Supporting a tough-on-Canada stance plays well rhetorically. But when aluminum prices rise 18% and the Ford plant in Wayne, Michigan starts talking about production slowdowns, rhetoric collides with reality. And here's the constitutional question that nobody wants to answer publicly, but every serious scholar is whispering about in faculty lounges and Washington think tanks this afternoon. The $1.2 trillion debt agreement was negotiated by the executive branch. It was never ratified by the Senate. It exists in the legal gray zone that post-war presidents have used to conduct international financial diplomacy without the friction of legislative oversight. Canada's unilateral withdrawal therefore puts the executive branch in the position of having to respond to a major economic rupture using tools, primarily IEPA and executive financial orders that operate outside normal congressional authorization. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee has already, as of 11 a.m. this morning, formally requested an emergency briefing from the State Department. Senate Majority Leader John Thune issued a statement 20 minutes ago calling the Canada situation deeply concerning and requiring immediate executive consultation with congressional leadership. That is the most polite way possible of saying, you made this deal without us, and now you are going to explain the consequences to us in a room where there are cameras. What does this mean for the American families watching this right now? What does it mean for the 62-year-old in Indiana who worked 35 years in manufacturing and is watching his retirement account? What does it mean for the 58-year-old in Florida whose mortgage is up for refinancing this spring? Here is the answer, and I'm going to give it to you straight. The immediate effects hit in 2 waves. Wave 1 is financial market volatility, bond yields, currency moves, equity market repricing of industrial sectors. This wave is already underway. It creates short-term portfolio pain for anyone with retirement savings in diversified index funds. Wave 2 is the supply chain effect, and it is slower but deeper. If the Canadian raw materials supply disruption persists beyond 30 days, manufacturing input costs begin rising across aluminum-dependent industries, automotive, aerospace, construction, consumer electronics. That cost increase does not stay on corporate balance sheets. It moves, as it always moves, onto price tags, onto shelves, into your grocery cart and your hardware store receipt. We are watching, in real time, the stress fracture in what geopolitical analysts call the hub and spoke model of American economic architecture. The model where Washington sits at the center and every allied relationship radiates outward like spokes on a wheel, with each spoke dependent on the hub but never connecting to each other. Canada just looked at that model and decided it was no longer willing to be a spoke. It is looking for connections that run around the hub entirely. And the most terrifying implication of what happened at 8:47 this morning is not the 1.2 trillion. The most terrifying implication is the signal it sends to every other spoke on that wheel, to South Korea, to Japan, to Germany, to Australia, to the Gulf states, all of them watching, all of them taking notes, all of them doing their own calculation about what the hub is actually offering them in return for their loyalty. Mark Carney did not just tear up a debt agreement this morning. He tore up the assumption that American economic dominance is self-sustaining. He tore up the belief that no ally would dare. And he did it with 11 words, a press conference, and the Canadian flag standing quietly behind him. The next move belongs to Washington, and Washington has to make it in full view of a world that is watching to see if the most powerful nation in human history can manage a financial confrontation with the country it has always assumed was permanently, unconditionally in its corner. Watch the bond market close. Watch the Fed statement at 2 p.m. Watch the Senate Foreign Relations briefing request. And watch very carefully whether any other allied finance minister makes a quiet phone call to Ottawa in the next 48 hours. Because that phone call, if it comes, will tell you everything you need to know about where this goes next. Subscribe, stay tuned. The most consequential financial week in North American history may have just begun.